My name is Lauren Wozniak, and I am the Program Director at Willow House. I'm pleased to introduce to you our new series, Living with Grief in Uncertain Times, Help and Support for Families. This new series is facilitated by Willow House's senior trainers, Pamela Gabay and Andy McNeil. This will be a 5-part series released weekly online. At the 6th week of our series, we will have a live Q&A session with Andy, Pamela, and myself. Please bring any questions and thoughts that you might want to share. We're looking forward to supporting you virtually at this time.
Hi, I'm Andy McNeil here with Pamela Gabay, and we're delighted to share a conversation, a discussion over the next 20 minutes or so as part of our Living with Grief in Uncertain Times series. Today, we're going to be discussing understanding grief and loss and how it impacts families. Really, when I think about this topic, I think about a number of the families that both Pamela and I have sat with over the years to provide support, and what are the questions that people approach us with when they're first sitting down to talk about their loss or talk about the experience of grief. And one of the first things that I usually talk about with the person is that grief is a natural reaction to loss. I think there are a lot of mixed messages that might be out in our society about grief and how grief impacts us. One of the most popular is the idea of stages of grief, that there are a series of stages that you might experience in your grief, ultimately leading to a place of acceptance. And while many of the issues in each of those stages are an accurate picture of some of the experiences that people have when they're grieving, grief itself is not as nice and neat and orderly. Pamela, I didn't know if you had some thoughts on that as well.
Thanks, Andy. I would agree with you that we learn about the stages of grief in our high school health books, and we learn about it in popular literature that's out there. Anytime anybody is going through somebody dying and they're grieving, there's a well-intentioned friend or family member who might ask them, well, where are you in the grief process? Are you in the anger stage?
Right.
And what it does for people who are grieving is it gives them this awareness that there should be some order to grief. And in reality, we know after so many years of working with grieving families that there isn't an order to grief, that grief is very messy and grief is all over the place. And when we are beholden to things like stages, then we think that there is some timeline to grief. And if we just can master these stages, that we will get through it and end up on the other side where we'll be just fine. And it's not to say you and your family won't be just fine, but it's just not the steps and the stages. And one of the things that I'd like to mention is you're not doing it wrong if you're doing it very differently than these stages.
Right. I've had families who come to me and they'll say, I think there might be something wrong with me because I'm not progressing through these stages. And so it really, I think in our mind, at least I can speak for myself and others that I've spent time with, it causes an added degree of distress quite often to think that something, maybe there's something wrong with me because I'm not doing it right. So I do think that is an important first point. And one of the things that I would say to those of you who might be, viewing this discussion is that grief is a normal reaction to loss, but it is not necessarily neat and tidy as far as that goes. One of the other things that I like to say when I think about grief is that grief grief is an experience. It's something that we're living. It's not a problem per se that's in our life that we're trying to find a solution to this problem. It's something real has happened. Someone we care about has died, or we've lost a job, or we've some significant experience, and quite often traumatic experience is happening in our life. And so we're living something that's real. And that's true for parents in a family. It's true for adults. It's true for children, and true for teenagers as well. Although we might go through it in very different ways, and we can probably talk about that a little bit as well. But I think that, to me, that's another important piece to this.
Yeah, and when we're thinking about the experience of grief, I remember early in my career, a young child saying, I feel like I'm on a roller coaster ride that I didn't want to be on. Yeah. And another child in the group said, yeah, we didn't buy this ticket. And, we were forced on this. And so many families in the years since have said something so similar, that they're on a roller coaster ride, and they're forced on this ride, and they're strapped in, and, there's twists and turns, and there's anxiety, and there's fear, and there's feeling nauseous, and not knowing what to expect next, and not knowing when the ride's going to end. And that is very much what grief is like. And when you think about families, every single person in the family is on their own roller coaster ride of grief.
Yeah. That is a very important point to all of it. I mean, it's the sense, and I love the illustration of the roller coaster ride, because you're also not in control of it. Mm-hmm. So many people will say, I feel like grief is happening to me. Like what are my choices in that? And how do I find my footing? And I know on some of the other conversations we're going to have in the future, we're going to talk about, there are some choices we can make in the midst of our grief. But quite often, grief is happening within us internally, happening around us, happening and impacting us, and in a number of ways. It's another way I like to talk about it is that grief isn't just something that's happening in our head. It's not something we're just saying, or even not just something that's a series of feelings. We quite often just associate feelings with grief. But I've had a number of people who've said, yeah, I feel sad, but it's something else too. There's something more to it, almost a language that we don't have to talk about what that's like. If you've ever felt, that pressure in your chest that you just kind of sort of always there. You go to bed at night, it's there. You wake up in the morning, it's there for some time that you carry that. So really thinking about grief more as grief impacts really all of who we are, mm-hmm. emotionally, spiritually, physically, mentally, and even socially. Even those interactions that we have with other people, we find are impacted. And I'd probably add another one, which would be also affects our family dynamics. And again, we'll get more into that in some of our other discussions that we'll have on this particular topic.
And one of the really emotions that come through so strongly with grief is the sense of longing for the person, longing for the life that they knew, longing for the routine, longing for the future that they would have had. And that is one of those feelings that really is pervasive, where you mentioned going to sleep and waking up, that sense of longing. And sometimes in the very beginning of grief, people have trouble putting their finger on that emotion. There's a feeling of almost like being followed around by something they can't quite identify. And it is often that feeling of longing for the person and everything that went along with that person being alive and with them. Yeah.
When you say that, it reminds me of that. It's an ache. It really is it's more than just a sad type of thing. It's that longing. It's that ache that happens inside. Another emotion that I've seen rather common, and really all ages, is, and it's not one that we typically associate, and is the word jealous. And we don't always associate that sense of jealousy, where we get up and we look and we see other people just going on with their lives. Like, it's like I went to bed and it feels as though somehow everything should stop because of the way I feel. And I get out of bed and I'm walking around the world and people are just going to work. They're doing their kind of normal thing. And I don't feel that way. I've had children who have used that word. They've tried to find it and use the word jealous because they look at other kids, maybe if they had a mom or a dad die and they say, well, I don't have my mom, or I don't have my dad, or I've even seen a parent who spouse has died and raising kids and looking at others and saying, I don't have that person, my significant other to support this process, or I'm on my own, and those types of experiences. And sometimes, again, it's an emotion that's hard to articulate, but even I think leads to a sense of, another emotion will be a sense of just loneliness, that I'm in this on my own and it's just me.
And feeling isolated.
Yeah.
And when I think about families during this time, we think about uncertain times, the isolation is so much more pervasive and increased now because of COVID and everything that is going on in these very uncertain times. Isolation and feeling lonely and loneliness has always been a huge part of grief, but even more so now because families can't get together in the traditional ways that families have come together in person, whether it be attending a funeral or memorial service, a burial, even coming to the home afterwards to be together. All of that has changed now. And that really adds an increased layer for families in their grief.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm glad you brought up, even particularly during this time, it's interesting how there are a lot of conversations that are happening nationally about, the experience that we're all going through with COVID. And I've heard a few people mentioning it, but really we're seeing a lot of grief reactions due to these changes in our daily lives and routines, right? And so, if you're already grieving and then we have a situation like COVID, you're right, it can just exacerbate that sense of isolation. I don't know that I've had people who over the years I've had conversations with, and, we asked the question, if you have a series of losses, do they just kind of make you numb, or does one just enmesh with the other? And it's been my experience that each loss that we have has its own sort of framework and impact on our lives. And so it's I think it's more that it multiplies, sort of the impact that we have, and certainly can increase the stress on a family and a family unit and how they interact together. I would
agree with that. Multiple losses, rather than making us stronger, multiple losses enable us to know more, right? Yeah. We have more understanding about the grief process probably, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we can handle the next loss, even better. Andy, you know this about me. I ended up in this field because when I was in my early 20s, my dad died. Yeah. And then a couple of years later, my mom died. And with my dad, I didn't know anything about grief. And I had a brand new 3-week-old baby, Megan. And because I didn't know anything about grief and I didn't know anything about how to react or how to do grief, if you will, and I was overwhelmed and shocked by everything, I tried to tune everything out and just focus on being a brand new mother. A couple of years later, when my mom died, I realized that really hadn't worked out that well for me shutting my dad's grief out, because it came back and sort of found me a few years later. And so when my mom died, I thought, okay, that way didn't work for me. So I had the knowledge that there might be a different way that would work for me. And so I sort of dove into my grief when my mom died, sort of head first.
Yeah.
And, and what I've learned really about all of that is that each of us will have a different way to cope.
Yeah.
With every loss. And Andy, you mentioned before loss of a job. I want to talk just for a moment about all the secondary losses
please.
that are happening right now. And so, many of you who are watching this are tuning in because you've had somebody very important and special in your life who has died. And some of you might have had more than one person in your life who has died. On top of that, due to everything going on with the pandemic, you might have lost your job. Sometimes people, after somebody dies, they lose their home because of finances or having to relocate, many different reasons. But these are all what we call secondary losses, and they impact our grief greatly.
Yeah.
If you want to add, Andy.
Yeah, no, I mean, all I would really add to that, thank you for bringing that up, is even though we call them secondary losses, they have a huge impact. It doesn't mean that they're not significant. It's tremendously significant that there are other things that we're struggling with in addition to maybe the loss that we've experienced sort of, leading up to these other things. One of the things I wanted to mention too is, I remember years ago when I was providing counseling to parents who were dealing with the death of a child. And I remember particularly one mother who came in, and I'll always remember the way she described it is I typically would start and just say, what brought you in today? And, sort of in a counselor-y kind of way. Right. And she looked at me and she said, my entire body hurts from the tip of my toes, the top of my head. My body hurts. I can hardly get out of bed in the morning. I feel I'm carrying a weight on my chest. It's like something heavy is just always sitting on me. I feel terrible. And it was interesting because she used sort of this is how she feels, but it wasn't her emotions. She was saying physically, this is how I feel. And I've run into so many people over the years who describe it that way, that grief isn't just emotions. It's not just thoughts in our head. It physically is impacting our bodies. And I've had this experience myself when I grieve, and even family members who would come to me and say, why am I so tired? Mm-hmm. I'm exhausted, but I can't go to sleep at night. I can't fall to sleep because mentally, my mind is full of all of these things, but I'm so exhausted physically. I feel like there's something wrong with me, and so just that physical aspect of grief that's draining, I think, in people's lives.
Yeah, and you bring up sleep and being exhausted. That becomes a vicious cycle, doesn't it? Because we're already exhausted physically from and hurting from the grief and the pain of the grief. And then the fact that our pain and our thoughts and our longing, all of that, and the jealousy and the feeling like life wasn't supposed to happen this way, the woulda, shoulda, couldas, cause us to stay awake at night. So we wake up the next day or get out of bed the next day. Maybe we've not even slept all night, and we are even more exhausted. And the more tired you become, the more exhausted you become, the more that then impacts your emotions.
Yeah.
You're already in pain, and now on top of it, you're physically hurting so much and exhausted.
Right. And so thinking about that picture, I know over the last number of minutes, Pamela and I have we really created like this, okay, this is what it's like to grieve. And it even feels heavy. Like even talking about it, I can feel the heaviness of it. And thinking about that level of heaviness and what grief is, now thinking about a family. And everyone in the family is going through their experience. And we know that it's mental, emotional, physical. It's all of these things. And we're either interacting with each other or we're struggling with that. Or, if you're a parent who's also raising children and you're grieving, you're physically, emotionally exhausted, you feel somewhat alone in your grief, and you're saying, well, I have to be there for my kids, and how can I do that? Have the energy, and at the same time worrying about people within the family. Maybe you have multiple kids and one child is very quiet about it, really isn't showing much emotion. Might have another child that's very emotional and open about that and expressing it in that way. Maybe you have a child who's just very talkative, has to talk things out and constantly asking you questions or talking about the person who died. And for you feel like it's re-triggering you all over again. So, I've heard all of those dynamics, and I know in this series, we're going to talk further about all of those things, about our, how it impacts you, how it impacts your kids, all of those things together. But I think it's somehow an important piece of this conversation as well, this idea of how do we understand grief and how does that impact certainly us as individuals, and how does it impact us as a family, and what does that look like? Because there are ways to cope and with our grief, but at the same time, there are these dynamics that are impacted within our families.
Oh, absolutely, Andy. And, I look forward in this series to exploring, different ways of coping and, the ways the family changes and the ways the family adapts. And we only have just a couple of minutes left here. I thought maybe you might want to talk just a little bit more about the series that's coming up.
Yeah, I would love to. And, I do hope it was helpful to at least hear a conversation about what grief is like, if for no other reason than to say, if anything we've said resonates with your experience, I would encourage you to take that and take a deep breath and say, okay, I am normal. Even though these are not normal circumstances, I didn't ask for this, I didn't want it, but okay, that's what grief is. Now I know what to call it. I didn't have a name for it. I didn't know if this was the way that people experience it, but it's good to know that what I'm going through is a normal experience. And I would just add one more thing. If what we talked about isn't exactly how you're experiencing it, that's okay too, because grief is not just prescriptive. It's not just something that is the same for everyone. There are differences. And again, we're going to explore this some more. So we do look forward to more conversations. Those conversations will be how to help yourself in grief, how to help your children, teenagers, how to cope individually and as a family. And we're going to spend some time talking about change and growth, because you can't talk about grief without talking about this idea of transformation, how grief impacts our lives and we transform in a lot of different ways. And though we didn't ask for whatever happened, there can be growth in that. So we look forward to having future conversations on these topics.
Absolutely. And I would say also, you're doing the best you can. And just know that you're doing the best that you can.
Right. So thank you for listening in, and we'll look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you.